Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. For the U.S., the Middle East is a major arena. It may wish to focus on other theaters, especially China-Taiwan and Russia-Ukraine, but too much is at stake for it, so totally withdrawing is out of the question, and in times of crisis, it bolsters the reduced presence it maintains in the region. For Europe, on the other hand, if one tries to find a common denominator among dozens of capitals, the Middle East is mostly a nuisance, hopefully, to be pacified, but not having a major impact on European affairs. Is there a bridge between these two approaches, and are there expectations to the general European indifference? Joining us to dissect all of these matters, from the Netherlands, Professor Uri Rosenthal, who formerly served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It's good to see you, Uri.
Good to see you.
It's always a pleasure indeed. Also joining us from the United States is Professor Russell Berman, who formerly served as a senior advisor at the State Department's Foreign Planning Staff, and currently he's the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Project at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's good to see you, Russell.
Good seeing you, Jonathan.
It's a pleasure indeed. With me here in the studio, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us, and if you may, let's start holistically.
So the last time there was an Arab-Israeli war in October, just before the U.S. elections, was almost 70 years ago, when Israel went to war against Egypt alongside two European powers, if Britain can be called a European power. Not a continental one, but nevertheless, of course, it was in cahoots with France as well as with Israel. Now, 68 years later, the situation is totally different. Israel's only protector and benefactor, much as it is the United States of America. European powers are basically cool towards it in varying degrees. Germany may be, in general, more favorable. Other nations are not. Some of them are for certain Israeli policies. There is a difference between Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and all in all, even though many Israeli officials are dissatisfied with the level of support they get from Washington, it is much better than what they can expect from Brussels, Berlin, Birmingham, or Bordeaux.
Indeed. With that being said, of course, it's quite interesting to note that the Germanic nations within the European continental structure are far more supportive of Israel these days than their Frankish counterparts or the Latin angle of the continent. But Professor Rosenthal, I'd like to start with you. What can you tell us about European foreign policy? Naturally, we're going to have a change of the guard from a European institution perspective, and we're seeing also a shift in the majority of the various member states and non-member states within continental Europe and the British Isle.
Well, first and foremost, let me say that an important change will be with the high representation in the foreign policy in the European Commission, where we will see Mr. Borrell disappearing from the stage, which is a very good thing for Israel. And he will be replaced by Madam Kallas from Estonia, which she is going to be more balanced, at least, than Borrell. And there you go. Actually, in relation to what Amir Oren said, Borrell is from Spain. Spain is also, again, these days, very aggressive mode towards Israel. Like, for instance, Ireland, and also, by the way, in the northern part of Europe, Norway. the support for Israel will come indeed more or less from Germany, although there I see that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Madame Baerbock, from the Green Party, is getting lukewarm now towards Israel. So the picture is rather bleak. And let me also add to this, you already mentioned it in a way, that when it is about the Middle East and you're talking about European indifference, let me say that priority number first, second, and third in Europe is actually with Ukraine. And the situation there is very, very bad. And we are looking with quite some anxiety to the coming winter over there. So the span of attention actually is mainly with Ukraine and only second with the Middle East, even these days, where as far as the European countries are concerned, they are especially now keen on getting their people evacuated from Lebanon. That is the main priority they seem to have at the moment. And for the rest, last but not least, when it is about the incursion, the ground incursion in Lebanon, they are rather restrained in saying that that would not be okay, but they are immediately, of course, warning for an expansion of the ground incursion like in 2006.
Indeed. Well, of course, Europe is not cohesive. So if the Netherlands and Germany are more supportive, of course, on Israel's right to self-defense by conducting the defensive maneuver within Lebanon, we see France, that regards itself, at least historically speaking, as a protector of Lebanon, coming out and voicing or calling upon Israel to avoid an incursion, sending, of course, Foreign Minister Baron to Beirut to have conversations with the Lebanese elites. Unfortunately, they weren't able to sway Hezbollah to stand down, and therefore we're seeing what we're seeing today. But nonetheless, when we're looking at the across the pond situation, Professor Berman, the United States, obviously, right now has a very important task within the age of strategic power competition, and in nature, strategic power competition is global. Therefore, the Middle East is also a very significant factor thereof, and we're seeing that the various maritime lanes that are so vital for the rules-based order and freedom of navigation and commerce at large, it's being targeted specifically right now in Bab el-Mandeb by the Iranian proxy Ansar Allah, namely the Houthi tribe dominated organization, and they're looking also to potentially expand this into the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. Are you seeing the right measures being currently implemented at a time when we are so near to the finish line ahead of the U.S. election just a month from today?
Jonathan, your description is accurate. Let me just add one point with regard to Europe. Europe's significance in all of this is nothing like it was 70 years ago or 170 years ago. Europe has gone through a process of voluntary disarmament and plays no role as a military force in the region. Perhaps an ancillary role, they might, the British, the French, if there were an aerial attack, but Europe is irrelevant as a serious player. What we watch in Europe is some huffing and puffing in the diplomatic world, and what Hubert Védrine says or what Madame Baerbock says, you know, it's interesting, and we Europeanists can ponder it, and why does she shift her position 10 degrees to the right or to the left, but this is really irrelevant to the realpolitik and the military situation in the Middle East. Coming to the United States and the current situation, the United States has been, the Biden administration has been AWOL with regard to the Houthis and the endangerment of the shipping lanes. If the United States' role as a as a global power is to maintain the freedom of navigation, particularly in such a vital region, and it has done maybe the minimum or maybe not even the minimum in deterring the Houthis. The Israelis at such a great distance from Yemen have done much more, frankly, to deter the Houthis than has the Biden administration. Nonetheless, the Biden administration is in the run-up to elections. I don't think it wants to take any dramatic action. History may force it to take action, but it is clearly trying to avoid a sharp-elbowed position in this matter. The political leadership, President Biden and of course candidate Harris, affirm support for Israel, but continually call for a ceasefire, which in the current situation undermines the Israeli position. On the other hand, the defense establishment is in effect supportive of Israel and the Lebanon initiative, even though the military leadership rightly maintains a low political profile.
Mr. Oren?
Well, that's very true. We see that both the CENTCOM leadership, that is General Kurilla and his second in command, Admiral Cooper, as well as members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whenever they can indicate their position, they are for what the Israeli Defense Forces has been doing, especially admiring what transpired in Lebanon over the last 2 weeks. It's not only IDF, it's also the Israeli intelligence community, which, of course, has an excellent relationship with its U.S. counterpart. But one has to also consider the fact that CIA Director Bill Burns, who is held in high esteem in Israel, has been conducting mediation regarding the hostage deal, but is also probably, this is just an educated guess, but he is probably also involved in some back-channel conversations with Iran. One cannot otherwise explain the restraint, relative restraint, shown by both Tehran and Washington after several events which took place over the year which started on October the 7th. It would be much more than sheer coincidence that these two parties refrained from attacking each other or the Houthis, as was mentioned.
Even though, when we're talking about the Iranians, I mean, there is plausible deniability with regard to Iranian involvement when we're talking about Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th. But we do know that they stood behind the time span in which there was an expectation for a certain action. The eyes of Israel were northward rather than southward in the thinking that the power disparity to the south would not trigger the initial blow from that theater than the northern.
This was Israel and its illusions rather than some grand deception. Looked at from outside of Israel, the United States is behind Israel, providing it military aid and diplomatic cover. Of course, we know that it's not always that cohesive, but nevertheless, if you take out Iran and the United States out of the equation, you cannot explain not only what happened in the Middle East over the last year, but more importantly, what did not happen.
Indeed. Well, Professor Rosenthal, I don't want to drive back to 1625 when the Netherlands took part in the largest battle of Hormuz at the time on a naval scale. But I'd like to ask, in light of the fact that Europe and the various European nations are required to bolster their strong power, their military capacity to confront the various challenges. You highlighted, of course, the challenge emanating out of Russia, but there are additional challenges, including migration, predominantly from Africa and the Middle East, which does pose a genuine threat to European nations at large and the Western civilization as well. Is Europe rebuilding itself to be able to yet again be, albeit in a secondary role to that of the United States, but be a more significant partner to realpolitik on the global stage?
Well, let me say that with regard to migration, the migration problem in Europe, which is really very, very urgent indeed, the European Parliament elections a couple of months ago showed a quite extensive shift to the right, and that is a favorable situation. That's one. Secondly, when it is about, you were talking about the willingness of the European countries to spend for their defense, for the defense on the global scene, I would say they are lifting, they are actually increasing their defense expenditures, mostly because of on the basis of the pressure coming from their American counterpart. Most of the European countries are now going to 2% of their gross national product for within the context of NATO. But it is true that is not meant to be for the global purposes, but especially in relation to Ukraine. Certainly, if you allow me to say one thing about what Amir Oren was saying about Iran, for both the United States and at least two of the main countries in Europe, Germany and the UK, they are of course engaged in these protracted and very unpleasant negotiations with Iran, often through the back channels, on the nuclear issue. And there I should say that I'm keen on what is happening there in Iran. And with regard to Iran, I vividly remember that at a certain moment, and a rather delicate moment, the US, for instance, released billions of frozen of assets through intermediary of no country less than Qatar, in order to actually accommodate the relations with Iran. So there I would say that something is to be wished for the coming months and years.
2 points. First, with regard to what you noted earlier about the departure of Josep Borrell, I think it's not only good for Israel, it's good for Europe. We still have to wait and see whether Callas, who had some scandals of her own during her tenure as Prime Minister of Estonia, is going to rebound from that and show the hawkish attitude, of the Estonians who are spearheading not only in defense spending of the gross national product, as you mentioned earlier, but also in their vocal rhetoric vis-à-vis Russia. The matter related to Germany always surprises me, since when the Russians invaded Germany, of course, a different period, and the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany at the time were horrendous. Nevertheless, the Russians did not necessarily trigger voluntary disarmament of the Germans. They had a policy of rape and murder and a lot of other things, and there are certain reports of up to 4 million Germans raped during the Russian invasion into that country for the sake of pacifying the Germans. So there were different activities that occurred there that, of course, need to raise a lot of questions to the German people these days when Russia is at the doorstep of the Baltics. But nonetheless, Professor Berman, I'd like to ask you, when we're talking about the United States. Russia obviously is very much involved in the Middle East, and albeit a relatively weak country, when we're talking about its military prowess and its capacity to withstand economic hardships, if indeed sanctions are enforced and it faces conventional pressures on multiple locations, the Chinese are not yet invested in establishing their own security architecture beyond their naval base in Djibouti, something that, of course, does not yet pose as significant a threat rather than the economic activities that it is pursuing in multiple countries and the various reports of it employing non-conventional methods in order to win various minerals within the various continents at hand. How should the United States alter its approach in order to once again compete also on the economic level and on a whole of government level, so to speak, and not only militarily?
Jonathan, let's not miss the forest for the trees. The United States faces a joint challenge from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It's not an organized system, but they cooperate in efforts to degrade the West, in the United States in particular. The way you ask what the United States should do, the United States should commit to winning in Ukraine and winning in the Middle East. It's not that hard to understand. Neither the United States nor Europe despite verbal support for Ukraine and despite significant military materiel support, there's no evidence of a commitment to really win this war, which would mean taking it into Russia. There's too much fear of escalation. So what's happening right now is that the United States and Russia are letting Ukraine survive, make Russia bleed, millions, well, many dying. But the idea of a victory does not belong to the vocabulary of Washington or Brussels, and that's the tragedy. And the same goes for the extended Gaza, now Lebanon war. The only place where you hear of victory is in Jerusalem, not in Washington, not in Paris, not in Berlin. There, it's about ceasefire, which means effectively conceding to the enemy, and that's a recipe for endless war. As these endless wars continue, naturally public resentment develops. And I would attribute some of the recent electoral results in Europe not only to the immigration issue, as Professor Rosenthal has mentioned, but also a disappointment, a war weariness with the fighting in Ukraine. If the Ukraine war had been won a year ago, this would be over. If Brussels continues to drag its feet, if Paris and Berlin talk Zeitenwende but really don't vende anything, Ukraine will lose, thanks to Europe.
Mr. Owen?
Secretary of State Tony Blinken a few days ago coined the phrase, interests, not individuals. This could, of course, apply to Nasrallah and many other occasions. But, of course, individuals matter. And this is what is going to happen on November the 5th. We will see whether there will be a Harris administration or a Trump administration. And according to either of these two results, whether the Biden administration in the 2.5 months until January 20th will come up with some sudden initiative regarding our own region. So just to note, earlier this week, Jimmy Carter celebrated his 100th birthday. Jimmy Carter should be remembered for his Camp David and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, but also for his passivity when Khomeini took over in Iran, which in hindsight is no less a major event in Middle Eastern history than the peace between Israel and Egypt.
It also indicates something interesting. Carter was far superior, intellectually speaking, to Reagan. Ultimately was much more passive and less proactive in many of his activities than Reagan, who was a lot more creative and thinking outside of the box and was managing to reassert U.S. dominance globally. But we have time for one sentence or half a sentence of each. Professor Rosenthal, go ahead.
Well, perhaps I could say that today is the first day that for the Mark Rutte as the new Secretary General of NATO. And let me say to you that for Israel, as far as NATO is relevant, that is a good thing. And he is a friend of Israel and will not easily give up on that. And with regard to Russia, let me say that he is very straightforward with regard to Russia, because he has, of course, his history with these MH17 disaster calamity in 2014, reinforced, of course, by the invasion of Russia in Ukraine.
Professor Berman?
These past few weeks have been represent a historical turning point in the Middle East. The myth of invisible Hezbollah has been wiped away like a spider web, and Israel has done much that supports the interests of its own security, but also of the West against our enemies.
Absolutely. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Professor Berman, Professor Rosenthal, and Mr. Oren for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at tv7israelnews.com.